A couple of things. The first was that the same conditions exist in many different countries around the world. The second was the potential, the mitigation potential for this is quite significant because wildfires contribute as much as 10% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and a significant proportion of those wildfires is these type of savannah fires. And the third thing was that there was an actual real project generating real credits for Indigenous people, which is very rare. All this RED discussion, for instance, is about planning, and there hasn't actually been a real credit. But in Northern Australia, in Western Arnhem Land, they've actually put in place an agreement where they're generating real credits. And as the Minister just said, there's now a new project which launched last month which generates a credit under a regulatory scheme. So all these things kind of make it a very exciting project for a think tank for the UN like us, because we saw this massive potential to transport this technology to many other places.
And when you're talking about technology, tell us in sort of layman's terms, if you can, exactly how is this going to work on the ground?
What's happening around many savannah areas in the world is a very similar story, and that is that the areas have been managed by traditional fire for many thousands of years, have adapted to that traditional fire, and in the last 50 or so years, for a variety of reasons, that fire regime has been suppressed. And so what we're planning to do is go into those areas where that's happened, work with the communities and work with the governments and the other local stakeholders to reintroduce the traditional fire management practices for the biodiversity outcomes, for the mitigation outcomes, adaptation outcomes, health outcomes, social outcomes, which have been evident and a strong driver of these projects in Northern Australia.
And are you confident that this project can be rolled out across the world, or at least to places where savannah fires are an issue?
We're very confident there's a lot of potential in many sub-Saharan African countries and Latin American countries, and in fact the beginnings of this is seen in many different places, like for instance Namibia. They are actually reintroducing the traditional fire practices for conservation reasons and for social reasons, food security reasons, but they're not capturing the benefit of the mitigation outcomes. So we're going to be working with the local communities in Namibia, for instance, to try and add on the added benefit of mitigation and carbon credits. But similar kind of situations exist in many different countries, like Mozambique, Brazil are two very big countries where we'll be working as well.
And I guess a final point, there's been a lot of talk this week about working with Indigenous communities. It's almost a sort of phrase people just drop in sort of willy-nilly, but in terms of suggestions you might have for how projects, how governments can work with Indigenous communities, what suggestions do you have, what tips do you have in terms of sort of bridging that gap and reaching out to people who are sometimes, I guess, a bit sort of split off from the mainstream climate debate?
Well, this project has many, the pilot project in Northern Australia has many lessons for governments who want to do that. I think the chief one is, from the government's perspective, is one of respect. It's very important that the governments understand that the knowledge and the systems and the efforts that these Indigenous communities make is truly valuable, and many governments don't understand that. So once you can have that, then anything's possible. A real relationship is built on that true respect. In our case, we feel uniquely privileged within the UN system to be able to work with Indigenous people, because we're the only part of the UN system which is autonomous. We have something called academic control, so our governing body is composed of individuals and not governments, and that allows us to develop a very special relationship with Indigenous people, work with them very closely because they understand that we're independent, and that means an enormous amount to them. I think another thing which is really important is timescales. Governments work to much shorter timescales than Indigenous communities, and we've seen that in RED projects where the ambitious timescales, which were initially put in place 2-3 years for the first stage, 4 or 5 years, just were unrealistic. And that's again the case with the pilot project in Northern Australia. It took 10 years to put in place the building blocks and another 10 years to put in place the kind of the legal parts and the community parts of the benefit. And so we're taking that on board. I think the RED experience needs to take that on board. And so there's some of the things. You need time and respect to work properly with Indigenous people.